So these 4 questions were actually part of the homework from last night, some of them. So I'm going to go over them quickly. We're going to try to see if we can figure that out. We're changing fractions into decimals and then percents. Let's look at 23/4. Remember that a fraction is a division problem. So you do 23 divided by 4, top divided by bottom, top in the house. 4 goes into 23 5 times. 5 times 4 is 20. Subtract, that's a 3. Remember to add a decimal and carry it up. I always add a couple zeros. Bring down the 0. 4 goes into 37 times. 7 times 4 is 28. 2, bring down the 0. 5. So the decimal is 5.75. When you get confused about, do I move my decimal point to the right or do I move it to the left? Easy little shortcut is, if you want to put a percent symbol, you're going to move to the right, because in that direction it's the percent. So 1, 2 to the right would make it 575%. Similarly, the 0.0015, to write it as a fraction, you write it as you read it, then simplify it. Or, if you want an easy little way of remembering how to write fractions into decimals, or the other way around, decimals into fractions, what I would do is I would look at the 15, because that's the significant digits, and it's going to go over however many space values there are, that's how many zeros in the denominator. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4 with a 1, that's 10,000. Right? That's like a shortcut. I used to always get a different, because of the fact that English was my second language, I used to have a very difficult time trying to remember what the place values were. Tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths. I would always confuse something until I realized that the place value has the same number of zeros as the number of digits in the decimal. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4 with a 1 is 10,000ths. And then you simplify it. What can I divide 15 and 10,000 by?
5 and then 5 again.
By 5. 15 divided by 5 is 3. 10,000 divided by 5, shortcut way. 5 goes into 10 twice, and then there's 1, 2, 3 zeros. So the decimal changed to a fraction is 3 over 2,000. Decimal to a percent, I'm going to again move it 2 to the right. 1, 2. So it's going to be 0.15 or 0.15%. It's not the same thing as 15%. Percent into a decimal. I have to move it 2 to the left. You're trying to get away from the percent, right? So 0.08%. I want to move away from the percent symbol. 1, 2, add a 0, and then it's going to be, the decimal point is right there, and it's going to be 0.123 zeros and an 8. Notice the percent symbol is gone because you went to the left. You made it a decimal. Now, how do I write this as a fraction? What's the shortcut way? 8 over, let's see how many zeros. 1, 2, 3, 4 again, which is 10,000. And then divide by 2. And when I do that, I get, divide by 2, divide by 2. 4 over
5,000.
And then I can divide by
4.
2 or 4 again. Let's do with 2 because some people, it takes a little bit longer. So divide by 2, and you get 2 over 2,500. Divide by 2 once more, and I get 1 over 1,250. Everybody get that? Awesome. Okay, a fraction into a decimal. how do I change, if I wanted to change this fraction into a percent, would I be able to do it really quickly?
No.
What would I have to do first?
Divide it by 2.
You can't divide 5 by 2. Every fraction is what kind of a question? Division. And so, if I wanted to go straight into percent, there's no way I could put the denominator and make it 100 because 8 times nothing gives you 100. So, I'm going to have to do the long division. 5 divided by 8. Add my decimal point, carry it up, add some zeros. How many times does 8 go into 50?
4, 5, 5.
6 times. 6 times 8 is 48. Subtract,
2,
bring down.
10,
How many times does 8 go into 20?
2,
2 times 8.
16,
Subtract, you get.
4,
Bring down a 0.
5.
5. So the decimal is 0.625. What is the percent? 1, 2, 62.5%. So now that we are quite comfortable with changing decimals to percents and writing decimals and fractions as percents and decimals in one another, we're going to talk about something that's going to be very, very highly used in your life, and that's percents. We're going to talk about taking the percent of a number. We're going to be talking about how to find the percent that a number is of another number. And we're going to talk about what the total base would be of something if you took the specific percent of it. So there's 3 different things you can ask. The first is what the percent is. The second is what percent of a number is of another. And then finding the base of percent problems. The percent proportion formula, if you wanted to have a template or a framework of how to find something, they refer to it as is over of is the same as percent over proportion. I'm sorry, percent over 100. Basically what this is saying is the following. If I had a rectangle, and I know that the entire blue rectangle is 100% of the rectangle, if I decided to cut it into 4 pieces, and of those 4 pieces, if of those 4 pieces, I took 3, there's lots of different things you could say. You could say that 3 out of 4 is the same as how much out of 100? This is the percent proportion.
75.
The percent proportion says you take the part, 3, because 3 is the part of the 4 whole. You put it over the whole, and that's going to give you the same as how much out of 100. A proportion is like an analogy. You're comparing the part numerically out of the whole, which is numeric, in the same way that that part would be out of 100. So this is the percent proportion. Is over of is percent over 100. 3 out of 4, if I wanted to write it down so that you could see visually what it says, we could say something like 3 is 75% of 4. Notice that if I was to write it in that proportion, the is the 3, because 3 is. So you would say 3 of 4 is the same as 75 per 100. Every time you see the percent symbol, I want you to think of out of 100. If I say what percent, that what is out of 100. Now let's put it to use. If you're using the percent proportion to find an unknown quantity, what you're going to be doing is setting up what we call, or what I call, an analogy. A proportion is an analogy. It's comparing things to one another. And that proportion is in the manner that you see up there, that special formula. Is over of is percent over 100. But most importantly, if you don't memorize that, what you need to comprehend is how to set up the analogy. So let's look at number 1. It says 56% of 46 is what number? What you have to do to set this up, if you wanted to set up a proportion, you're basically setting it up as follows. Way number 1 is to say, okay, 56 per 100, and literally write that down. 56 is to 100, or 56 per 100, is the same as what number out of 46? When you see the word of 46, it's saying out of 46. So that means 46 would go in the denominator. And n is my unknown number. 56 is to 100 as how much is out of 46? Now, hopefully you remember from last year that when you are solving a proportion, you cross multiply and divide. So your equation would then move like this. 100 times n is equal to 56 times 46. And you would actually do the work. 6 times 6 is 36, carry the 3. 33, add a 0. 24, bring up the 2. 20 and 2 is 22. 6, 7, 5, 2. And how would I continue solving from here? What do I need to do?
Divide by 100.
Very good. You divide by 100. And when dividing by 100, the decimal moves to the left 2 spots. When you're dividing by 100, you're making it smaller, and the decimal moves to the left 1, 2 spots. So you get that the number that you were referring to was 25.76. So when you're setting up the proportion, is over of, notice I did it backwards. I did percent over 100 is the same as is over of. The 46 is what number is here, over the of 46 is the same as 56 over 100. The other way of doing it is by using an equation. Some of you may really comprehend the percent proportion much better, and some of you may understand writing it as an equation better. Let me show you how to do this problem if it was an equation. The equation method says rewrite everything, understanding what each word means symbolically in math. 56% is really 0.56. Of means you're multiplying, times 46 is means equals what number is n? And you're literally just multiplying 0.56 times 46.
That's easier.
Yep.
If you do the multiplication, you're going to get the same exact answer. 4 times 6 is 24, 2, 22, 2, 2, add down, 2, 5, 7, 6. Remember the rule of multiplication with decimals? The answer must have the same decimal place values as all of them in the original. And you get that the total is 25.76. The difficulty with setting up the equation is remembering that if they give you a percent numerically, 56%, you have to translate it to the decimal. and then remember how to multiply decimals. So when they give you the percent and they give you the number you're taking the percent of, you literally just do a multiplication problem. Okay, let's look at another one. Now, this question does not give you the percent. It asks you for the percent. If you see the difference between the two, you notice that the first one says 56% of 46. So it is giving you the actual percent, and it's giving you the number you want to take the percent of. Number 2, however, is asking you to figure out what percent of 69 is 153. Now let me show you proportionally. Remember, when you set up a proportion, you're comparing part to whole, part to whole. What percent? The number n, or the letter n, or x, or however many, or p, is the variable in this case that's telling me percent. It's asking what percent. Because it says what percent, I'm going to put p as my variable. P for percent. What percent of 69? That means that you took a specific percent of 69 and it gave you 153. If I take a percent of a number and it gives me a bigger number, what do you know about the percent? It's over 100. If I started off with $69 and I took a percent of it and I ended up with $153, I more than doubled my investment. That means I must have been more than 100%. Keep that in mind. So when you're setting up the proportion, you would say, what percent, and so this part is what percent, so P over 100, because it's what percent. So what, as in P, percent of 69 means out of 69. Out of 69 is 153. Is over of is percent over 100, and the P is my unknown. I would cross multiply, and I would get
Why is the P your unknown? Why won't it be like
69 times P is equal to 100 times 153 is 153 with 2 zeros. Do my long division, divide, divide. When I do the long division, I am going to get what the percent is. And because I already took 100 into account in my original problem, the answer I get is already written as a percent. Do my long division. 69 goes into 153 2 times, I believe. Subtract. 69 goes into 150 again twice.
and then just put a 0? Oh, no.
Bring down. And then it goes in I have to add a decimal and bring it up. 69 goes into 120 once because twice is too much. One.
Good job.
We're going to stop there. That's 221.7. And it's already a percent because I took it into account right there. So just to review this one before we do the equation method, you would say what percent, so what over 100 is the same as out of 69, 153. 153 out of 69. Cross multiply and solve your equation. The equation method, again, might be a little bit more straightforward. What percent? That's telling you P is what you're solving for, correct? P is percent. So what percent of, as an equation means what operation? Of means times. 69 is 153. In other words, if I wrote it algebraically, it would be 69p is equal to 153. What would I do to solve? Divide. Do my long division. And when I did my long division, as I did a little while ago, I would get 2.217. What do I have to now do? Move the decimal. In your original equation, there's no 100 in here, is there?
No.
So that means you did not take the fact that you're talking about out of 100 into account. So your job is, when you do the division, if you use the equation method, because you're not taking the actual 100 of the percent part, it's your job to remember the answer is not 2.217%. The answer is move the decimal 2 spots to 21.7%.
Okay, this is hard.
What is 25% of 60? I would like for you to try this one. Proportion way. 25% is the same as how much out of 60? Cross multiply and we get 100 and is equal to 25 times 60 is 1500, I believe. Divide by 100 means you move the decimal 2 to the right, or do that, and you get that n is 15. Proportion way. Equation way, pretty straightforward. 25% of 60 means you're taking 0.25 times 60. Do the multiplication. Remember your rules, add 2 decimal places, and you also get n is 15. That means that if you take 25% of 60, you're going to have 15. 15 is the part, 60 is the whole. What percent of 1800 is 36? If you're doing the proportion way, is over of is percent over 100. What percent would be n over 100? What percent is the same as, the question says, of 1800 is 36. Is 36 over 1800? You would then cross multiply, and you would get 2 as your answer. And because you already took the 100 into account, you would leave it as 2%. Please make sure you're answering in the manner in which it asks you in the question. The question says what percent, so your answer has to be 2%. If, however, I wrote it as an equation, how would I write it as an equation? What percent?
P equals
Yeah, well,
6.
P, what percent of 1800 times 1800
Equals.
is 36? Write it algebraically. 1800 times P is the same thing as 1800P.
Is it?
And then you divide by 1800. And you have to do your long division. 36 divided by 1800. Decimal point. Add some zeros.
Can you just do it mentally?
Some people can, some people cannot. 1800 goes into 360? No. 1800 goes into 3600? Exactly twice. Exactly. So you get that the P is 0.02. But because you did it the equation way, you must remember to 100 is not in it. So I have to do what?
Move the decimal point twice.
To the?
Right.
Excellent. 2%. 320 is what percentage of 4? Try to visualize it in your head. Don't just read it and try to translate it. Imagine what you're doing here.
32%.
You've got 320, and that, they want to know what percent of 4 it is. what percent of 4 is 320? Yeah, you ended up with a much bigger number than you started with. Because you have 320 and they're asking you, that was what percent of the 4 you started off with? So it's going to be a huge amount of percent over 100. Okay. So as a proportion, again, looking at it rationally before you even begin is the best way to do it. That's what we call thinking about your thinking, metacognition. Don't just go straight into doing it. Read it and imagine it in your head. 320 is what percent of 4? Wow, that means I started with 4 and I ended with 320. It's going to be a huge number over 100. If you get something less than 100, you did something wrong. 320 as a proportion. 320 out of 4 is the same as what out of 100? Cross multiply and you get 4n is 32,000. Divide by 4. N is 8,000. And because I already took the percent into account, the answer is 8,000%. As an equation, 320 is what percent times 4? Okay, p times 4 is the same as 4p, if you wanted to look at it algebraically. Divide by 4. P is equal to 80. Please do not think that the answer is 80%. You get P equals 80 and you're like, yay, 80%, I'm done. But you use the equation method. And the equation method does not take the percent out of 100 into account. So your job is to take that 80 and change it to a percent by moving it 2 to the right. 1, 2, 1, 2, 8,000%. So you notice that with the equation way, even though sometimes it seems much more straightforward, if it's asking for percent, you're going to have to remember that you have to move the decimal 2 to the right. So here's another problem. 12 is 80% of what number? They use the proportion method. 66 2/3%. Well, hopefully you remember that 2/3 is 0.6 repeating. You can work that one out if you look at it. And then this one here, 8 is what percent of 48? What would the equation look like? The equation would say 8 is what percent times 48. When it asks for what percent, you're going to have to move the decimal. 48p is equal to 8. The biggest mistake I see you all make is that you know 6 times 8 is 48 and you think the answer is 6. But it's not.
600.
Nope. You're dividing by 48, which is going to make it a small little number. It's going to make it 1/6. And 1 divided by 6 is 0.16 repeating. And 0.16 repeating is actually, move it 2 to the right, as you said, 16.6 repeating percent. Do you see how 8 divided by 48 is the same thing as 1/6? And 1 divided by 6 is just 0.166666666. So then it's really move it over. Go ahead and translate these other equations, these into equations without working it out. 2.6 is 40% of what number? We're going to run out of time. So this one would be 2.6. 2.6 is 40% times x. And 40% would be changed to 0.40. So to write it as an equation, it would be 2.6 is 0.40 times x. Then you would divide by 0.40. X is 0.90 times 0.045. Remember to change the percent to a decimal if you are making it as an equation. So if you wanted to write the equation for this, you would write what number, x, because that's what we don't know, is 25% of 90. So they're asking you what 25% of 90 is. In this case, what you would do is you would set up what number, that's your unknown, is 25% times 90. Remember, you have to change the percent to a decimal, and then it's a straightforward multiplication problem, and you get 22.5. That means that 25% of 90 is 22.5. 15% of what number is 2.4? Again, as an equation, 15% times what is 2.4. Change it to a decimal. And then in order to solve, you're going to divide by 0.15. And when you do your long division, you get 16. If you wanted to set up a proportion for this, you would set it up as follows. 15%. 15% of what number? That means they want to know 15 is related to 100 in the same way that out of what number is 2.4? So is over of. 2.4 out of what? 2.4 of what? Out of what number? You would cross multiply and you would get 15x is equal to, when you multiply by 100, you move the decimal 2 to the right, that's 240. Then you would divide by 15. And when you divide 240 by 15, 15 goes into 24 once. Bring down. 6 times 15 is 90. X is 16. What this is saying is that 2.4 out of 16 is the same as 15 out of 100. So you could choose which way you want to do it, as an equation or a proportion. I recommend that you try to figure out what works best for you. Everybody works differently. If you write it as an equation, it's important that you recall that once you're doing the work, you have to change the percent, if they give you the percent, into a decimal. They're not asking you for the percent, they're giving you the percent. So your answer as 16 is just 16. There's no need to move the decimal point. You only move the decimal point if they say what percent, such as this one. What percent of 90 is 27? Writing it as an equation. What percent, so x times 90, what percent times 90 equals 27? That's the same thing as 90x equals 27. Divide by 90 on both sides. And when you divide, long division, 27 divided by 90, have to write a decimal point, add a 0. 90 goes into 270 exactly 3 times. That gives you 270 with 0 left over. So x is equal to 0.3. However, they asked you what percent. In your work, nowhere do you take the fact that percent is really talking about 100 out of 100. Therefore, it's much more important when you're doing an equation to remember that if you are asked what percent, your final answer must be changed to a percent by moving the decimal 2 to the right. 30%. Moving the decimal 2 to the right is the same thing as multiplying by 100. So the answer is 30%. If you chose to set this up as a proportion, you would set it up like this. What percent? What percent? Anytime you see the word what, that's your unknown. You can use any letter you want. What percent of 90 is 27? That means they want to know, out of 90, 27 out of 90 is what percent? And now you cross multiply. You get 90n is equal to 27 times 100 is 2700. Divide by 90, divide by 90. When you go to do your division, you can either recognize that since there's a 0 on top and 0 on the bottom, simplify it, and then you do 270 divided by 9, and that's going to give you 30. Now here, you already took the 100 into account, so when you get your answer and they say what percent, it's 30%. There's no need to move decimal points because you kind of already did by associating this 100 into the proportion to begin with. So the big difference is with an equation, you have to remember that you take 100 into account and then multiply by 100 to move the decimal. When you use a proportion, you're already using the 100 in the equation itself. So you get the answer that's already as a decimal. 18 is 4.5% of what number? 18 is 4.5% times what number? Change the 4.5% to a decimal, and you have 18 is, remember you move it over 1, 2 to the left, this gives you 0.045 times x. Now you're going to divide by 0.045 to both sides, and once you do the long division, you get exactly 400. That means that if you took 4.5% of 400, you would be left with 18. Let's look at it as a proportion, just in case you decide to do it as a proportion. 18 is 4.5%. That means 4.5 goes over 100. 18 out of what number? 18 out of what is the same as 4.5 out of 100? Again, do our cross multiplication. 4.5 n is equal to 1800. Divide by 4.5. And when you do your long division, 1800 divided by 4.5. Divisor must be a whole number, just the rules of decimal division. Move that, add a 0, bring it up. 45 goes into 180. Well, 45 times 2 is 90, so double the 2 will give you 180. Exactly. Bring down the 0. 45 goes into 0 0 times, and that is your answer. Now, in this case, your n is equal to 40, and notice that they didn't say what percent, they say what number. That means they're not asking what percent. That means your answer is already the number. Only if they say what percent do you have to remember to either move the decimal, if you wrote the equation, or put it over 100. Okay. What I'd like for you all to do, if you're watching this from being out, you are going to complete the F6.2 worksheet, evens, on the second page only. Work on it this weekend. Be ready for it. Email it to me by Monday. Have a great weekend.